Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. Let us extend a warm welcome to the Professor Michael Useem as he joins us on our podcast. Professor Michael Useem serves as the William and Jacalyn Egan Emeritus Professor of Management and Faculty Director of the Leadership Center and McNulty Leadership Program at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He teaches MBA and executive MBA courses on leadership and management, offering programs globally. He works on leadership development across private, public, and non-profit sectors. Professor Useem is the author of several books, including The Leader's Checklist, The Leadership Moment, The Executive Defense, and co-authored The India Way, Learning from Catastrophe and others. He is also the co-anchor of Leadership in Action on Sirius XM Radio. Professor Useem earned his PhD and MA from Harvard University and his BS from University of Michigan. In this episode, Professor Michael Useem will share profound insights from his widely acclaimed book, The Leadership Moment: 9 True Stories of Triumphs and Disaster and Their Lessons for Us All. Professor Useem, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Deepak, thank you for having me. It's my honor and privilege to be in dialogue with you and your listeners.
Thank you, Professor. The leadership moments you describe span a wide range of fields, from business to military to social entrepreneurship. How can leaders today apply the lessons from these diverse scenarios to tackle modern challenges, particularly in the age of rapid technological change and globalization?
So, Deepak, it's a good question to start with because, in a sense, it's the most fundamental question of all. We're not born, with maybe a few exceptions, as leaders. It's something we've learned over the years, maybe from a teacher, maybe from parents, maybe from relatives. But nobody starts with a whole lot of leadership capability. But look at the great leaders of our generation, and in many cases, they made enormous differences. And the obvious question that follows from that statement is, well, how did they exactly go from not a whole lot of leadership soon after birth to the fact that in their later years, they really have made an enormous difference? And I've come to conclude, watching many people in action, that one of the best ways to think about your own leadership, to commit yourself to making a difference in the lives of others, is to look closely at those who have made a difference. Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi. Let's think about the moments, the pivotal moments in their lives. Mother Teresa, let's look at the pivotal moments in her life. And we admire the individuals I just named, but equally, we can learn about our own leadership by looking very carefully in some detail, almost as an inside companion. By watching what they do, we, I think, learn better about what we should do when our leadership is on the line. So to sum it up, Deepak, the leadership moment really is intended to be a kind of a vehicle, the book, for people to almost imagine they were there on the slopes of a Himalayan mountain or caught in a firefight or in some other way. We're at a moment of a pivotal moment when somebody's leadership is going to make a difference. And the book and much of my teaching is devoted to bringing people into moments when they feel like they're there at the elbow of a leader who's leading. And by watching what these extraordinary individuals have done, we can become better ourselves.
Professor, in your book, you highlight Roy Vagelo's decision at Merck to develop a life-saving drug for those who couldn't afford it. What does this example teach us about the role of ethics in leadership, and how can leaders today balance profit with social responsibility?
So the backstory on Merck, I'm glad you raised the issue there, is a scientist named Bill Campbell who loved his work. He was devoted to combating diseases. That's why he took the job when Merck invited him into the research and development division of Merck, a huge US-based pharma company. And he discovered that a product that they had developed to combat parasites in animals might be adapted, molecular structure altered, and then tested, hopefully proving that it's a safe product in the field, a real field test, controlled experiments, all that, that could stop or at least slow, but in many cases stop the spread of a terrible, terrible disease common in West Africa, also a bit evident in South America and in Central America, called river blindness. And the scientist, Bill Campbell, went to the then director, the senior VP for research and development, and said he'd like a lot of money to alter the molecular structure of what was then called ivermectin, and then test it in the field, make certain it was a safe product if it was actually applied once the molecular structure had been improved for humans. But it was quickly pointed out by Roy Vagelos to Bill Campbell. He basically said, Bill, it's going to cost a lot of money, maybe 10 years in today's dollars, maybe $1 billion, for you to develop this product. And if you do develop the product, the victims of river blindness have no money to buy it. In fact, they're not even near an apothecary or a pharmacy where they might buy it. So, Bill, if I give you $1 billion, $100 million in today's dollars over 10 years, I want to remind you that we are a for-profit organization. And while this is very worthy and notable, and possibly life-changing for up to 20 million people who had river blindness, help me understand why we should go along this direction. Bill Campbell, the scientist, very persuasive guy. It was his leadership moment, along with that of Roy Vagelos. He said, in the end, maybe 10 years, 15 years out, once the product is developed, we're going to have to give it away. But I believe, and Roy Vagelos was drawn to the argument, that even though other foundations, the US government, some of the governments of Africa would likely turn down a request for help, and they did in the end, Roy Vagelos and Bill Campbell believed that in the longer term, this product would ultimately find acceptance, application, and if it was effective as they had thought, and it turned out to be so, that surely the World Bank, the World Health Organization, governments around the world would ultimately step forward. So it was partly an ethical decision, going back to the Merck, call it the mission statement. Let's make products that people need and somehow profits will follow. But equally important was Roy Vagelos's belief that once the product was developed, even if no foundation was willing to step forward at the time, when foundation officials saw 20 million people not losing their sight from this terrible parasite, a disease is called river blindness for good reason, that they would ultimately step forward. And that's exactly what happened. Many, many years later, Merck spending a huge amount of money to develop and distribute the drug. The World Bank stepped forward, the World Health Organization stepped forward, the US government stepped forward, other national governments stepped forward. And by the way, just a few years ago, Bill Campbell, the scientist who was the great advocate, traveled to Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize in Medicine. And while that's just a glorious moment for him and for many people who were strong advocates, it also proved enormously important when Merck set out to recruit good scientists. They could say, come and work here. Remember our mission statement, we'll make products that people need and somehow profits will follow. And thus, while it was a wrenching, short-term, expensive decision, the leadership, this is the leadership moment of Roy Vagelos and Bill Campbell, ultimately proved to be the right thing ethically and commercially. So long-term thinking is part of the formula of effective leadership, and we can see it in spades in the leadership moment at Merck.
Professor Eugene Kranz was faced with a near impossible task during the Apollo 13 mission. Yet, he remained calm and focused. What leadership qualities were key to his success, and how can leaders in high pressure situations maintain composure and make effective decisions?
This, of course, is reference to what in the US is simply known by the phrase Apollo 13. So with Apollo 11, several people got to the moon. Our first step for everybody uttered one of the astronauts as he put his foot on the surface of the moon. 2 years later, Apollo 13, on a trip to the moon, the oxygen tank, one of two oxygen tanks exploded, damaging the second oxygen tank. And pretty quickly, the astronauts and certainly the mission control people on the ground recognized that the spaceship hurtling towards the moon would run out of oxygen within a matter of hours, and they could not in any way return that capsule to the Earth without a couple days of travel. So it looked like a fatal moment was descending on the capsule. A person named Eugene Kranz, a fairly young mission director, is looking at 40 or 50 people in the control room in Houston, Texas, and they're all saying, all of the sub-controllers are saying, Mr. Kranz, we have a problem. They didn't say it, but the problem was that the moment of truth was approaching. They had enough oxygen on board for only at the end, when they really began to deal with the problem, was a matter of minutes. But Eugene Kranz, remaining steady, insisted that everybody focus on solving the problem. And ultimately, Apollo 13, from which the famous statement, Houston, we have a problem, comes from, he steadied the room, got it focused on solving problems, and through amazing improvisation, both on the space capsule and in the mission control in Houston, Texas, they were able to return the astronauts in a moment of shining triumph. All that said, the key to that success actually had happened a couple of years before, when Eugene Kranz was an assistant flight director. And his boss, the flight director, sitting in the mission control room, turned to Eugene Kranz and said, Gene, I'm going to leave the room. The rest is up to you. And what the big boss had just done is to give we'd call it a battlefield promotion to Eugene Kranz, who was quite young at the time. And Kranz said, hold it, boss, you can't leave, you're in charge. And the boss basically said, well, no longer, you're in charge. So it was a battlefield promotion along with a lot of mentoring, that when leadership became really, really essential, when Eugene Kranz faced his leadership moment, through the actions of his now former boss, his former coach, his former mentor, he stayed focused, worked through the problems, and ultimately brought all the astronauts back to Earth. And in the history of the US space program, this is considered one of the great recoveries from a near fatal set of circumstances. And that was ultimately a victory, so to speak, in bringing these astronauts back because of the technical know-how of the engineers, but equally the leadership skills of Eugene Kranz, flight director.
Professor Useem, Erlyn Blum led the first woman ascent of one of the world's most dangerous mountains. What leadership lessons can be drawn from her journey, and how can leaders encourage diversity and inclusion while tackling challenges in male-dominated industries?
Yeah, it's a really good illustration of the importance of diversity and well beyond. When Anna Perna, who grew up in Chicago, she was a city person, and despite that became attached, stricken, summoned by mountains, high mountains. The call of mountaineering, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay had climbed Mount Everest for that reason. wasn't for the money, it wasn't for the glory, it was for the triumph of standing on some of the world's largest mountains, in their case, Mount Everest. Several years later, Arlene Bloom, that's the way she pronounces her last name, Bloom. It looks like Blum, but in any case, she decided she had climbed some of North America's highest mountains, that she was ready to climb Annapurna, which is lower than Mount Everest, but it's one of the world's great mountains, over 26,000 vertical feet to its summit. And by the way, extremely dangerous in that the mountain and the main route up the mountain itself is often swept with avalanches, which are absolutely fatal if you're caught in one. In any case, Arlene Bloom decided she was ready to climb Mount Everest. She had climbed the highest mountain in North America called Denali, which is up in Alaska. She wrote letters to a number of expeditions going to the Everest region, and from several she heard back that her credentials were very, very good. Her technical competence was very, very good. But the letter said, I'm sorry, your presence as a woman in an all-male expedition would work against the kind of male camaraderie that these individuals deemed to be so important. So the reason I featured Arlene Bloom in the book, The Leadership Moment, is for a reason that will emerge in the next couple of sentences. She said, "Oh, okay, it's an unjust world. I think I'm qualified," and she was qualified, by the way. So she said, "If I'm going to be turned down, by these male expeditions, I'm going to create my own and just do it myself." And the phrase I tend to apply to that in leadership is even if you're not fully in charge, she was in charge of nothing. If you believe in a purpose, a cause, an agenda, don't be shy about taking charge and leading change, even if you're not fully or formally in charge. And that was her case. She was in charge of nothing. She decided to make it an all-women's expedition, although there were a number of male Sherpas from Nepal on it as well. And she managed, after many weeks, to get several people on the expedition to the summit of Annapurna. Again, it was at the time the mountain had been climbed before, but it really was the first all-women's expedition to reach one of the 14 peaks that are more than 26,000 feet. The main point of the chapter on Arlene Bloom and Annapurna, though, is to drive home the point by watching up close somebody who was turned down, in this case because of her gender, to refuse to surrender to that rejection, and as an act of leadership, to step forward, even if you're not fully or formally in charge, put yourself in charge, which is what she did, and she succeeded. And her expedition to Annapurna, just like Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's expedition back in 1953 to climb Mount Everest, Annapurna will not have the fame that Mount Everest did, but her expedition was the first all-women's expedition to a major peak, and it will be in the annals of mountaineering history forever.
Very inspiring. Joshua Chamberlain's leadership at Little Round Top during the Civil War is legendary. How does his ability to inspire his troops in the face of overwhelming odds translate into modern leadership practices, especially in uncertain or high-stress situations?
That's good. The story told now in a chapter in this book of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a fairly young guy from the state of Maine, Northeast U.S., who had volunteered to be a soldier during America's terrible Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The two biggest armies in North America at the time, one for the North, the Union, one for the South, the Confederacy, encountered each other at a small town not too far from where I sit today in my Commonwealth, we call it, of Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania. And the two armies engaged what becomes known as the Battle of Gettysburg, the biggest battle ever fought in North America, hopefully for all time, a pivot point, a turning point in the U.S. Civil War. And in assistance of that turning point, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ended up in an almost impossible circumstance. He had about 400 troops under his command. He was at the far left flank of a Union line that was being attacked, and it looked like it was being attacked successfully by the Confederate Army. And Chamberlain's troops had run out of ammunition. So, at a moment when it looked like the Union was going to be overrun by the Confederacy, which is to say the South would have won the Civil War instead of the North if what was feared did happen, Chamberlain, who had not been an Army officer before he was brought into the U.S. Army, but having been mentored by others, having studied military strategy, devised almost a shocking strategy to save the moment when he was out of ammunition. The countermeasure that he applied, I should say, saved the day. I won't go into it. It's rather detailed in its particulars. But Chamberlain, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a civilian soldier from the great state of Maine, saved the second day of a 3-day battle at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was one of many such actions, so he's one of many heroes on both sides. But in any case, what he did in particular was pivotal in leading to the defeat on the next day of the Southern Army, the Confederate Army at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What Chamberlain did was what hundreds of people of his rank were doing, so he certainly doesn't receive all the credit for what happened there, but he is considered one of the great exemplars. I consider him one of the great exemplars of leadership when it really counts, making a difference. What went into that? Well, he was incredibly creative. He came up with a new strategy that worked. But he also, in the months leading up to that event, he had sought counsel, he had read books. He said, I'm not a leader of people in combat. And he was not. He was on a faculty of a college up in Maine before he volunteered to serve. But by the time he got to Gettysburg, through coaching, through mentorship, through reading, through simply watching what he was doing, with a year of service, his actions proved pivotal at Gettysburg, the battle, which ultimately has proved pivotal in U.S. history. He was one of many who led, but in the micro moment of his own leadership, we see unequivocally the importance of preparing yourself for what lies ahead. Good question for people listening to this dialogue to ask, what can you do now to ready yourself for some of the uncertainties ahead? And once you've got that answered, let's get on with getting ourselves up to speed so we can lead when history calls upon us to do so.
Clifton Wharton was instrumental in restructuring a $50 billion pension system that was out of touch with its customers. What does this story teach us about effective leadership in charge, complex organizations, and how can leaders ensure they remain aligned with their stakeholders' needs?
Deepak, one of the great challenges that companies face, whether they're in the US or India or Japan or China, Brazil, is that what got them here won't necessarily get them there. So the leadership, the methods that got you to your success at this moment have served you well. But paraphrasing a very well-known coach, executive coach in the US, Marshall Goldsmith, who wrote a book with the title that I just cited, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. This was what Cliff Wharton, no relationship to the Wharton School, concluded when he took over this huge institutional investor, TIAA. And he said, we built ourselves over many years with methods that were good at the time, but I'm just looking around, and the methods now that served us to get us here are going to make us fail in the next 10 years. So with a lot of pushback, just a lot of resistance, that's the normal condition that almost every leader faces if they have ideas that are potentially very good. Think Steve Jobs, as he brought the concepts that went into the iPhone into Apple Computer. He was an extraordinary follower of the dictum that I have to invent or really reinvent the company in its structure and its culture, how funds were invested in, how proceeds were distributed. And I had to do it now. And I had to get a lot of people to go in the same direction. So the Cliff Wharton story, so to speak, or the lesson for me is look around you, see what needs to be preserved. The culture often is an essential part of what needs to be preserved. But ask yourself, what do I have to do to be competitive now in the year 2030? And once you've answered that question, don't be shy. Get on with the task of making the changes as Cliff Wharton did at TIAA, the big institutional investor.
Professor Useem, my last question. Nancy Berry led Women's World Banking to address poverty in the Third World. What leadership traits were essential to her success, and how can business leaders apply the same principles to make a positive social impact while driving business results?
Yeah, Nancy Berry built what is called Women's World Banking, which is fairly similar to an organization that many people around the world are familiar with, Ramin in Bangladesh, which has long focused on microfinance, providing modest, very modest amounts of money to people who have almost no money to start a business, to create some kind of income generating activity. And she had no background in that. She had come through the Harvard Business School. She had worked at McKinsey. She had worked at the World Bank, enormous institutions. And she decided that there were several billion underserved women, underserved financially. They didn't have bank accounts. They didn't have insurance. They didn't have dental plans. They had no money. And they had no ways, no easy ways or no ready ways of creating income. And so she left the World Bank, uh, joined an existing enterprise called Women's World Banking, and led by purpose and cause, led by a belief that her calling on earth was to make a better world, in this case for 1 billion or 2 billion women who were underserved. She devoted herself to perfecting the model that the current president of Bangladesh, who created Grameen, has long followed, which is to ensure the people, the poorest of the poor, the unserved, the unbanked, have access to capital in appropriate amounts such that they can apply their entrepreneurial energies to build a small business, ultimately increasing that size, ultimately providing cash to send their children to school and maybe even a university later on. So Nancy Berry illustrates many of the points that I've come to conclude are vital for the leadership moment. But what I really want to stress here, and it's increasingly important now, which is making certain that you're doing what you really want to do, that there's a purpose. It's not just an income, it's not just a job. It's an agenda. It has a purpose. We need to commit to it. We need to follow it. We need to build on it. And that's exactly what she did. It's for that reason that I thought a chapter on Nancy Berry had to go into this book. Many others follow this particular pathway. And in looking at her closely, we can see what it entails. Not easy, has to be creative, but it also has to be delivered by determination, since there are a lot of bad days and not so many good days at the outset. And Nancy Berry got through it and created an organization that has prospered to this day.
Listeners, thank you for joining us on today's episode with Professor Michael Useem, where he shared invaluable insights from his all-time bestseller book, The Leadership Moment. Professor Michael Useem, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for your invaluable contributions.
Deepak, thank you. Great to have a dialogue with you. And let me just say, by way of closing, as we think about leadership, you and I obviously think about that a lot. And I'm sure your listeners the same thing, the challenge here is to move ideas into action. So we've touched on these ideas, but I would encourage everybody tuned into this particular dialogue to think about how Nancy Berry and Eugene Kranz and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and others went from what they were doing, like a lot of us are doing, to stepping forward and making a real difference because they could. We all can. We just have to learn how to do it. And then, above all, we have to do it.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael Useem, for sharing your insights.
Great. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you.